Greetings, traveler. My name is Sir Belgard, and I am the last knight. Tonight I will tell the story of the last elven tribe, which had to defend its right to exist with fire and sword. If, of course, your heart turns out to be brave and your mind sharp. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to receive more magical stories. And let's begin. In the morning, when the forest had forgotten its birdsong, Elian counted the heartbeats of the sleeping trees and learned that the oldest of them, the one the tribe called Grandmother's Root, had only 300 breaths left before the sap of memory would cease to rise. And at that count he rose from his mossy bed with a shiver that belonged not to the chill of dawn but to the realization that the last tribe of elves might meet their twilight before the moon crossed the river, and he whispered into the bark with the forced tenderness of a healer who knows that soothing hands are a promise as much as a craft, promising again what he had promised every day for 3 years, that he would find a way to keep the song alive, even if it meant giving up what little warmth remained in his own veins. The light filtered through the canopy like tired gold, the dew tasted of iron and old smoke, and though such a taste had never reached this sanctuary before, Elian said nothing of it to the disciples who followed him with baskets and laughter. He knew that the young needed comfort, pretending that routine was a shield. His days began with tending to the lamps, glowing with seeds, delicate bulbs grown from river pods and star moss, which he trimmed with a bone knife and sang, bringing back the brightness with notes that weaved through the loam and returned softened by roots and stones, an ancient liturgy learned at his mother's elbow before the winter that took her voice. After the lamps he visited the nursery, where 3 children slept under blankets sewn with grass threads, and he laid a palm on each forehead while their mothers watched with eyes full of patient storms, for births had become as rare as white ravens, and each child was a contract with tomorrow that the forest could no longer afford to sign lightly. Elian's closest friend, Merwin, a huntress whose arrows were feathered with leaves that could catch footsteps, came over as he hummed over the smallest of the sleepers. She leaned against the doorframe with the free grace of a person who moves like water even when she stands still, telling him that the southern traps had been found empty, and the tracks of the moss wolves now smelled of ash rather than moonlight, which meant that something was fouling the streams beyond the boundary stones. Elian replied with a frown that brought new lines to a face too young to bear, that he would speak to the council at noon and refer the matter to the high matron, for the tribe could not afford another secret, while the old oaks still whispered of the finer rings. As the sun reached the broken column that marked the center of the village, the council gathered under a canopy made of canvas salvaged from the last migration, while around them watchers practiced their silent signals with white feathered fans in case the surrounding kingdoms decided again that old blood made good trophies. High Matron Ledial, who was both fierce and gentle, as a mountain can be both an immovable rock and a cave of protection, listened to Elian's report, her hands clasped over the necklace of 12 seeds that hung around her throat, one for each grove they had lost since the Soot War. And when he had finished she said that his care for the children and the lamps did him honor, but the tribe needed more from him than silent miracles, for his voice could charm seeds to sprout in the winter, and his courage had driven back the last invaders without a drawn sword, and if he did not carry the talker's staff, she would at least ask him to walk the borders in the twilight, and bring the truth, for truth was the only food that did not spoil in times of fear. Then Merwin spoke, her words firm. She hinted that she would go with him, for the forest loved her feet and disliked his habit of thinking so much that he forgot to listen, and the council laughed wearily, like a candle shielded by its hands from the unruly wind, and the elder healer, Kelian of the Silver Scars, leaning on his staff, told Elian that the child's fever had cooled under his song, but that cooling might be only a pause before the burning, and that the border must be checked before the next lunar cycle, or the tribe would lose not only the trees but also the threads that held the community together. After the council, the days slowly faded, and Elian mended a cracked water gourd with resin drawn from the bark of a beehive, while Merwin taught the youths how to navigate through the mist without confusing their own breath with that of the forest, and above the low roofs of woven reeds he could see the Sentinel Rocks to the east, where Torwin, the human smith who had once tried to trade steel for secrets, and had earned salvation and friendship in return by lifting his hammer against his own raiding party, now stood in exile of his own choosing, hammering out plows for the neighboring farmers who did not know that the invisible protectors of their safety slept beneath the elven branches. Elian often thought of Torwin, of the friendship that had crossed the burning rivers of history, and wondered if the tribe would ever allow a man to enter its heart again, for Torwin's reasons for staying were written in his rough hands and in the way he looked at the forest as if it were a cathedral, while the tribe's reasons for caution were etched by centuries of betrayal and not erased simply because one man turned his sword. Yet Elian stubbornly believed that bridges were not only for crossing, but also for teaching rivers to remember calmer paths, so he continued to weave his days into ropes that could bind strangers together if a storm came. Dusk fell with a purple breath and the lamps bloomed, and as Elian prepared for his border walk with Merwin, High Matron Lediel pressed a shard of moonstone, carved in the shape of a leaf, into his palm and said that if danger came he must speak his mother's name and the stone would remember the old sky to remind him that fear was a lesser thing than memory, and he nodded, though the gift tasted of farewell. And he had never liked the taste of such things. Then Merwin bowed and smiled so sideways that she made him forget that everything was ending, and they stepped into the silence behind the last hut, where the roots wove paths like careful hands. The boundary stones waited, pale in the twilight, and Elian reached out to touch the nearest of them with a leaf of moonstone in his fist, as the earth whispered with a tremor born not of river or hoof, but of the painted runes on the stone, runes that had not moved since the tribe had raised them, trembled and poured their colors into the earth, revealing themselves beneath a crack as thin as sadness, and as sharp as it was. And from that crack came a breath that smelled not of moss or fox or rain but of a forge that had forgotten to cool, and Elian froze, for the last time the stones had done this, the war of soot had begun. He looked up at Merwin, and she at him, and in the longer twilight they had sworn silently, without words, that tomorrow they would follow the crack, wherever it led, but in that moment, as night enveloped the treetops, the oldest tree in the heartland breathed its last uncertain breath and dropped a single leaf that turned to ash before kissing the ground, and the tribe felt the pulse of the trees pierce their bones. And Elian knew with certainty that the ordinary days were over, and that he had waited too long to fulfill his simple promises. The night split the sound that drowned out the village drums. The boundary stone in Elian's palm broke into two clean halves without dust and without delay. The earth moved upward as if a hidden door were being lifted, and from the new crack rose a pillar of dim light that did not warm hands or illuminate eyes, that made children cry in their sleep and made wolves across the river walk without howling, and before anyone could call a council, the nearest ash tree shed its bark in a single husk. That stood without a trunk inside, and then collapsed, and when the husk touched the ground, the moss curled up and burned without flame, proving to all who saw it that the forest was no longer hunting its own disease, but was welcoming a guest. Elian stepped back and grabbed Merwin by the wrist as the crack widened, the runes on the fallen stones smeared with symbols he didn't know, and from the far side of the border, where the human farms darkened in their fields, came a slow, dull thud that belonged to iron feet, not hooves or boots, and with that dull thud came the measured clang of chains, not dragging but pulsating in even strokes. And Merwin drew an arrow that had a leaf for a feather, and said that the air tasted of clay, which meant someone was walking on earth, while Elian pressed the moonstone against his palm until it hurt, calling his mother's name under his breath and feeling the shard grow so cold it numbed his skin, which was enough warning to grab Merwin by the shoulder and pull her towards the village path. They found High Matron Lediel already standing in the square with a necklace of 12 seeds in her hand, her gaze fixed on the glow rising from behind the huts, and as the first iron figure reached the edge of the trees, the lanterns throughout the village went out and settled into one slow breath, as if waiting for a signal, and then Torwin came running from the watchtowers without a hammer and without a coat, his throat parched with cold and haste, shouting that the farmers to the south had seen a black oven with wheels rolling on rails laid across the wheat, and there was a cage in the oven and men with ashen badges feeding the oven with earth taken from graves and cups of river water stolen from under-guarded bridges, and wherever the oven passed, frogs froze and birds flew in a straight line from it until they were gone. "Tell me straight," Lediel said, and Torwin bowed his head and said that there was a company of ashbinders behind the furnace, that their captain wore a helmet without a visor and a jaw of tattered metal, that he had spoken to the cage when no one was around, and it trembled. Torwin added without pride or excuse that the path to the furnace was his fault, for many years ago, when he had worn the raider's badge, he had marked the safest ford with a sign carved in the rock, the sign being a pattern known to the people of the furnace, and so the rails found the ford, and the furnace found the rails, and the company found the edge of the forest, and that meant that the sanctuary was no longer hidden. Merwin wasted no time in accusing and asking about the number of men and the pace, and Torwin said that the furnace was moving with the stubborn speed of a mill and would reach the village by the next dawn if it did not encounter traps, and by noon if the rails were stretched during the night, and Elian, who could still hear the iron feet treading along the edge of the trees, told Matron that a crack in the edge was pouring out a cold light, and that the trees were shedding husks that were killing the earth, and before he had finished speaking the eldest pupil had come out into the square with tears on his cheeks, for the blankets of the nursery had darkened at the corners, and one of the seedlit lamps had cracked and shed a slow silver tear, and Elian felt something in his chest tighten. "Wake the elders," said Ledial, and her voice carried through every door and every rope ladder. "Bring the children to the root hall now, and bring the seed chests and the bowls of memory. We cannot hold out with weapons alone, and we will not rest our hope on waiting." And she turned to Elian and said that his gift would be needed in the rift, that the runes there had changed, and that his mother's chance might still know the grammar of that which crawls, while Merwen would take the swiftest, and sow chaos on the rails, not to destroy, for the furnace would bring ruin if broken in the wrong place, but to force the party to camp wherever the forest chose. Elian ran with Merwen to the border while Torwin gathered the strongest to raise the stone gates of the root hall, and when Elian reached the gap, iron figures stood in a line behind the trees, faceless and armless, rounded at the ends where hands should have been, and from these ends rose short pipes that hissed thin smoke in rhythm with their breathing, and one of the figures stepped forward with a movement too smooth for a man and spoke in a strange voice, saying that she was seeking a path under the roots to the source of the river, that she would pay in grain and steel, and that she would not harm the trees if the elves opened the earth, and her words were calm and even and fearless. "We do not deal with empty voices," said Merwen, and the figure tilted its smooth head and replied that a voice was an instrument, and an instrument had no face, which made the students whisper, and Elian calmed them with his hand, for he had seen spirits wear borrowed mouths, and he tried with a low chord of the old chant to trace the power around the crack, which trembled in response, and the light retreated as if confused, then returned in a narrow beam that danced across the runes, and for a moment Elian saw a pattern he had seen only once. The day his mother disappeared, she had given him a bone knife and a piece of moonstone with a pattern on it. He added more voice to the chanting, and the crack groaned, the iron figures bowed their heads in unison. Merwen raised her bow and fired a leaf-covered arrow at the nearest figure. The arrow struck and did not sink, but unfurled the leaf and enveloped the figure, and the figure staggered, knelt and did not rise, proving that they could be thwarted, and the others took a step back, then stood still. And from the deeper ranks came a new sound that cut through the chanting, the ringing of slow applause, and the iron ranks parted in either direction, not turning. The man walked with steps that kept pace with the applause, his helmet open, showing a mouth marked by old heat, and the look that belonged to one who had learned patience, breaking it and rebuilding it until it obeyed. "I see," he said, looking past Merwen at Elian as if reading a name from a shard of moonstone. "Your forest is beautiful and your tribe is brave, but the roots of your trees lie above the room in which I was born, and I will reach it whether you open the door or I build a road, and I would rather make a deal than a mess." And Elian felt a chill, for the man knew a secret that had not been told since the earliest wars, and he replied that the tribe did not bargain on a sword, and the man smiled without warmth, and said that dawn would bring a stove and rails and a chest that would make the guards forget their work, and he set a small device on the edge of the crack, a puck of black stone with a single white mark, and then he stepped back and bowed with absolute politeness, and the iron figures lifted the fallen figure and disappeared into the darkness behind the trees, leaving the device where it lay and leaving the crack humming, so that the village stood in a circle around a problem that could not be ignored, and the last tribe felt the earth choosing its path without their consent. The morning after the council's decision was cold, though the sky was cloudless. Kael awoke to the sound of axes cutting into the trees outside his tent, the steady rhythm of preparation for a war most of them knew they could not win. He stepped into the light, his breath visible in the fresh air, and found his people, men and women of the last elven tribe, making spears, mending leather armor, and whispering prayers to the spirits of the forest. The youngest of them walked between fires carrying baskets of dried roots and berries, while the elders sat in a semicircle, casting spells to ward off fear. Kael felt the weight of the days ahead sink deep into his bones, for this was not just a raid they were preparing for. This was survival against an enemy that had destroyed all other clans. Irinder, the healer, approached him with a small wooden box, the lid of which was carved with symbols of protection. "Within are the Heartstones," he said, his voice low and insistent. "When the first flame reaches our homes, it must be carried to the hidden hollow. Without it, the bond between our people and the forest will be severed, and the land will forget us." Kael carefully picked up the box, its weight much greater than it seemed. The Heartstones were relics from before the earliest songs, said to be fragments of the first trees planted by the gods. Losing them would mean more than defeat, it would mean destruction. A figure emerged from the shadows by the palisade. It was Selan, a young scout whose sharp eyes and well-aimed spears had saved Kael more than once. "The people are moving faster than we thought," she said without preamble. "In 2 days, maybe less, they will reach the pass. They have brought war machines, huge iron and wooden things pulled by beasts I have never seen before." There was no fear in her voice, but her eyes betrayed a quiet desperation. "They are burning the earth behind them. Nothing will grow where they have gone." Kael nodded grimly and called the warlords to the central fire. They argued in low, insistent tones around the flames. The Ion, the oldest among them and a master archer, insisted that they strike now, driving the enemy out of the forest before they could bring their siege weapons within range. Others, like Maris, whose warriors wielded the great glaives of the western glades, urged patience, luring men into winding paths and hidden ravines where numbers mattered less than skill. Every plan carried risk, and every moment lost in debate the enemy could use to close the gap. As the voices rose, Kael's attention was drawn to the edge of the forest, where the shadows seemed thicker than they should be. Far away stood a figure, a tall figure in a tattered cloak, its face hidden beneath a hood. No one else seemed to notice. Kael rose and crossed the clearing, each step heavy with anxiety. The figure did not move until Kael was almost within reach. Then a hand emerged from the folds of the cloak, pale and marked with runes that pulsed faintly in the dim light. "You will not stop them," the stranger said in a voice that seemed older than stone. "But you can decide how your people will end. Stand and fight, and you will fall by the sword. Run, and you will be scattered in the wind. There is a third way, but it requires more than courage, it requires a surrender you will not want to make." Kael's hand reached for the hilt of his machete. "And what do you know of the fate of my people?" "I have seen it," the stranger replied. "I have walked the ashes of your homes. I have heard your songs, long forgotten." The hood leaned forward a little. "Humans are not the only ones who seek your end. There is a hunger in the land itself, and it stirs even now. If you wish to challenge both, you must come to the Stones of Merit by the next moonrise." Before Kael could demand anything more, the figure retreated back into the trees and disappeared, the shadows swallowing it all. He stood there for a long moment, the sound of the war council's arguments still echoing behind him. He could have dismissed the encounter as a trick of a weary mind, but the words sank deep, gnawing at his resolve. That night, as the camp prepared for what they believed would be their final battle, Kael gazed up at the distant hills where the Stones of Merit lay hidden. He had walked this path before, long ago, when the forest had seemed eternal. But now the choice was harder than the sword at his side, to follow the will of the council and lead his people into a battle they could not win, or to chase the whisper of a stranger's promise in the darkness. And before dawn, he knew he would have to choose. The sun had already set behind the cracked peaks when Kael returned to the council chamber, his cloak damp with mist, his steps heavy after another day of unsuccessful attempts to reach the frontier scouts. The ancient stone hall, carved from the roots of the mountain, was dimly lit by amber braziers, their light revealing the weary faces of the elders. They waited in silence, the kind of silence born not of peace but of the shared burden of bad news. Kael stood in the middle, his voice harder than he felt, and told them the truth they feared, that no messenger had returned from the northern passes, that the smoke they had seen 2 nights ago had not been from their own sentries, and that the paths to the old refuge were probably now blocked. Kael watched their eyes as the words reached them. Elder Silver grabbed the carved arm of his chair and asked if the guards of the great library could be awakened to protect the valley. The question was more one of hope than strategy, for all knew that the wards had been dormant since before Kael was born, their keys scattered after the last rift between the clans. He admitted this, but refused to speak of surrender. Younger voices were heard here, 2 warriors who had trained under his guidance, accusing the council of hiding while others bled, their anger hot and unexpressed. The air in the room thickened until Aranis, the oldest among them, tapped his staff and reminded all that the enemy did not yet know where the heart of the valley was, and that rash steps would betray its location faster than steel. When the council had broken up, Kael remained, studying the map etched into the tabletop. It showed not only the valley but also the scattered enclaves that had once been part of their people's domain. He traced the rivers with his finger, wondering if some clan lived in the swamps, or if they too had been wiped off the face of the earth. Footsteps approached softly from a side passage. It was Lyra, a messenger from the western forests, her hood drawn low. She told him she had news, but not for everyone. Outside, under the thin cover of rain, she told him that her spies had seen the enemy leader, a man who bore the crest of the Black Spire, a crest thought lost to time. She believed his arrival signified not simply a campaign of expansion, but a hunt for something buried in the valley long before either side's earliest memories. Kael's thoughts raced. If this was true, then losing the valley was not simply survival. It was giving up whatever weapons or relics the Black Spire sought. Lyra had warned that her scouts could not remain in enemy territory for long. The enemy seers had begun to weave spells that blocked vision. Her words were insistent, but her gaze lingered on him as if hinting at a deeper reason for her risk. She recognized that if the valley fell, her own forest home would be next, and she had no illusions that her people could withstand the same fire. They parted with an agreement. At dawn she would lead him across the unguarded ravine that led to the enemy camp. He would see their numbers for himself, and perhaps learn that they were digging in the foothills. Returning to his chambers, Kael found that the rain had stopped, but the air was heavy with the smell of wet earth. He sat by a solitary candle and began writing messages to the few captains he could trust, knowing that by morning he would be walking towards the same force that had brought ruin to their family. Sleep came hard. When it came, it brought visions of black banners fluttering in the wind that smelled of ash, stone spires rising where forests had once been, faces he had known turned away from him as if he were already a shadow among the dead. The candle burned faintly, and somewhere beyond the walls the night birds fell silent, as if the valley itself had held its breath. Lord Avaric stood at the edge of the earthworks, the cold wind tugging at the black and gold cloak that marked his rank. Below, his soldiers drove iron stakes into the frozen ground, marking the next extension of the siege rails. A great furnace loomed behind them, its heat lifting the air even in the cold. In its stone belly, gears and chains turned with a rhythm that became the heartbeat of his advance. He kept his hands behind his back, watching the action, counting the hours until the next assault. Every delay was a risk. Commander Warren came forward, his boots coated with riverside mud. Engineers report that the next section will be laid before dark, Warren said, his voice sharp with the efficiency of a man who measures every word. Once the furnace reaches the ridge, the forest bulwarks will be within reach. Avaric nodded, though his thoughts were not limited to bulwarks. The relic is there. I can feel it. Once the first stone is pulled from that valley, the scales will tip in our favor. No more equal deals. No more pretending that the old bloodlines have a place at the table. The elves will not give it up willingly, Wayrin said. They will have no choice. Avaric replied. If they fight, they will lose. If they flee, they will scatter. Either way, the valley will be mine. He turned from his work to look at the rows of tents that stretched across the plain. The fires burned faintly, their light revealing the discipline he demanded. No shouting, no useless drinking, no useless movement. Every man and woman here knew why they were coming. A smaller pavilion stood apart at the edge of the camp. Inside, Avaric's advisors waited, gathered around a large table where a map of the valley lay, weighed down by rocks. Ink lines showed every trail and ridge, every known stream, and the last marks of scouts. Avaric studied the new additions, fresh markings along the southern border, signs of movement that had not been there the day before. The elves stirred. One of the advisors, a pale man in scholarly robes, ran a finger along the southern approach. The protective guards will react if the furnace crosses it here. But we must also consider, this border is not where they will try to stop us. That is where they will try to slow us down. Avaric listened, but his attention was focused on one simple truth. The elves had not yet moved to defend their home. That meant they were still gathering, perhaps still arguing among themselves. He intended to use the time. We advance at dawn, he said. Not to the main pass, but here. He tapped the eastern ridge. They won't expect us to cross the shallow ravines. The furnace can handle the slope, and the ground there won't be as heavily defended. Wayrin frowned. It will bring us closer to their heartland before the siege lines are fully established. That's the point, Avaric said. The sooner we can pressure their leaders, the fewer allies they will be able to invite. I want them to make a desperate choice. He straightened, surveying the tent. Do not confuse this with a campaign against the scattered people. These elves are the last of their kind, and they will fight with the despair of defeat. We will not underestimate them. When the meeting was over, Avaric stepped outside into the cold night. The air smelled faintly of the resin from the trees that had already been felled for the rails. In the distance, beyond the black line of the forest, an owl hooted, then fell silent. He found himself staring into the darkness longer than he had intended. Somewhere out there, their leaders were watching, considering his movements as he considered theirs. He did not yet know their names, but he would soon hear them. The deep hum of the furnace reached his ears again, steady and unceasing. He took it as a reminder that time marched on, whether one side was ready or not. The attack would begin at dawn, and if his calculations were correct, they would be within sight of the valley's core before the elves could properly defend themselves. That was the plan. And he intended to make sure that nothing, not guard, not beast, not sword, could slow him down. The tent was empty, save for a single lantern, its light falling on a broad table, behind which stood Lord Avaric alone. The map lay spread out before his hands, but his gaze was not fixed on the lines of rivers and ridges. He was riveted to a small wooden box at the edge of the map. He carefully lifted the lid, revealing a shard of pale stone no larger than his palm. Its surface shimmered faintly, as if holding the memory of a light long since extinguished. He had taken it many years ago, in a battle most men had forgotten, but for him it never ceased to burn in his mind. It was a shard of elven Heartstone, torn from the ruins of a grove destroyed when he had been a commander serving under another's banner. The magic within it was weak now, slowly seeping into the air, but even in its fading state it proved the power that elves still possessed. This shard healed the wound in his hand that would have crippled him. He had not let the fever take him in the dead of winter. And it had shown him, in flashes of half-sleep, the form of the greater relic that had broken him. This vision had become his goal. The relic he sought was no mere jewel, or idol. It was the seed of Merith, a crystal grown in the First Age, when the forest and the elves were bound together. In elven hands it could restore dead land, heal mortal wounds, and cause growth from barren stone. In human hands, Avaric believed, it could do much more. It could make an empire impregnable, feed armies without supply lines, and transform the poorest fields into endless harvests. Now he was driven not by greed for gold or the conquest of territories, but by the conviction that the seed had been wasted on the maintenance of a people who could no longer protect it. He remembered the High Mark's council chamber, where he had once stood before the other lords and proposed an alliance to search for the relic together. They laughed. They called it a legend, the kind of tale one tells children. And the memory of their laughter was etched in him. If he had brought them the seed, there would have been no laughter. They would have knelt or fallen, and Black Spire would no longer be a name spoken only in old war songs. A sound from outside the tent interrupted his thoughts, Varen's voice, low but insistent. Avaric covered the Heartstone fragment, closed the box, and stepped out. The commander stood with 2 scouts, their armor stained with mud. Movement at the edge of the forest, one of them reported. 2 figures moving quickly, but keeping low. They were not near the camp, but they were watching the railings. Avaric studied the scout's face. Elves? The man nodded. Probably. Not hunters, they kept their distance. One had a fighting stance. Let them watch, Avaric said after a pause. They will carry the news to their leaders, and that word will force them to act. I want them to think they are still out of sight. That will make their next move predictable. As the scouts left, Avaric walked to the edge of the camp. The heat of the furnace enveloped him, mingling with the sharper smell of tar and oil stored for siege engines. Beyond the work lights, the forest loomed, a black wall against the starry sky. Somewhere out there, the seed of honor waited, guarded by those who did not understand what to do with it. He thought of cities that could be rebuilt after years of war, of fields that would never wither again, and of the power to dictate peace only on his terms. In his mind, this was not conquest. It was inevitable. And when inevitability demanded action, hesitation was nothing but a form of defeat. At dawn they would advance closer to the heart of the forest, the rails digging deeper into the earth until the relic was within reach. And if the elves refused to give it up, he would take it from the ashes. The forest was still heavy with mist when Kael and Lyra left the edge of the valley. The air clung to them in cold drops, muffling their movements as they climbed the shallow rise that led to the eastern ridge. Kael carried no armor, only a bow and a short sword, while Lyra moved forward with the precision of a man who had learned to tread where the leaves would not betray her. They spoke little. The forest spoke only in the faint moans of branches moving overhead and the occasional crackle of a bird disturbed in its perch. They moved in a shaky line, pausing often to listen. Kael mentally counted their stops, marking the points where the usual sounds of the forest seemed quieter. Lyra warned him that Avaric's scouts worked in pairs, silently and patiently, and that any thoughtless movement could have them stabbed in the back before they saw the camp. The higher they climbed, the more the air changed. The damp smell of moss began to give way to the acrid smell of smoke carried by the wind. Somewhere over the ridge, fires burned with unquenchable hunger. Lyra raised a hand at the crest, signaling him to stop. She ducked behind a fallen trunk, and Kael joined her, following her gaze through a gap in the trees. Below, spread out across the flat ground like a wound in the earth, was the enemy camp. Long rows of tents stood in disciplined lines, each surrounded by racks of weapons and crates of supplies. But the heart of the camp was the furnace, a huge, squat structure of stone and iron that pulsed with heat even from this distance. Rails ran from it on either side, disappearing into the forest behind them and continuing to the ridge ahead. The men moved along the rails, setting heavy stakes and joining wooden planks, their movements refined and precise. Kael's attention was drawn to a smaller pavilion that stood apart from the others, its canvas reinforced with dark lacquered panels. 2 guards stood at the entrance, their armor cleaner than the rest, their posture too alert to be routine. Lyra followed his gaze and murmured, "The command tent. Avaric will be there." There was a quiet note of hostility in her tone that needed no explanation. Kael shifted his weight to get a better look at the furnace. Its surface was covered with strange metal symbols, each one faintly glowing, and from within came a low, steady hum. It was unlike any siege engine he had seen. "This thing," he whispered to himself, "isn't built just to break down walls." "No," Lyra replied. "I've seen lesser ones in the ruins near my house. They get their energy from what they burn. But this is for something more than just fire. As they watched, a group of soldiers brought in a long chest, reinforced with iron hoops. The guards at the furnace stepped back, and the chest was carried inside. The humming grew louder for a moment, then subsided again. Kael couldn't see what was inside, but the change in sound made him uneasy. They stayed until the angle of the light began to change, the edges of the camp stirring with signs of a new workday. Lyra patted his arm, nudging him back down the slope. The return was slower, each step taken carefully so as not to break twigs or dislodge stones. Kael's thoughts turned at what he saw, the tracks cutting deeper into the valley, the discipline of the soldiers, the unnatural hum of the furnace. None of it fit the image of an army moving simply to claim land. When they reached the shelter of the valley's inner forest, Kael finally spoke. They're not just building a path for their war machines. They're building something that will move long after the battle is over. Lyra nodded curtly. And they defend it as if it's worth more than the rest of the camp combined. Whatever it is, this furnace is the heart of their advance. As they neared the village, the fog lifted, leaving the air sharp and bright. The council wanted to hear everything, but Kael knew that if they focused only on the soldiers and the rails, they would miss the real threat. The furnace was not just a weapon, it was a goal. And whatever Avaric intended to put in it, the elves could not let him finish. The council chamber was in a state of turmoil when Kael and Lyra returned. The elders sat on their carved seats, but the warriors lined the walls, leaning on spears and bows, watching him with an impatience that made the air heavy. Kael gave a detailed account of how the rails were laid in two directions, how the heat and roar of the furnace hinted at something more than just fire, how the guarded pavilion indicated Avaric's likely command post. He described the discipline of the soldiers and the speed of their work. With each word the room grew quieter, though not more so. When he had finished, Elder Silver broke the silence. "We can strike the workers before the rails reach the valley." "We can," Kael said, "but that won't stop the advance. They will recoup their losses and continue. If we want to slow them down, we aim for the furnace or the rails that are already built. A broken rail will buy us more time than a dozen soldiers missing." This sparked a debate. Maris argued that the furnace was too well guarded, that the elves could not risk so many lives for a single attack. Others argued that if the furnace was the heart of Avaric's advance, damaging it was worth the cost. Kael listened, but his mind was already forming a plan. When the voices had subsided, he said clearly, "The furnace is out of our reach for now. The rails are not. Tonight we are sending a small party, no more than 6, to chop wood and scatter thorns. We are working under cover of darkness, and we will be gone before they can gather. If we can get 2 or 3 miles, they will be forced to slow down while they recover. That is the time we need." The decision was made reluctantly, but without real resistance. Names were called, hunters and scouts accustomed to moving silently, fighters who could disappear into the trees as quickly as they appeared. Lyra was among them. Torvin, a broad-shouldered veteran who had once walked in enemy lines, volunteered without being asked. Kael would lead them himself. They gathered at the root hall as the sun set. Weapons were checked and checked, bows were strung, swords sharpened, ropes coiled. Kael surveyed each of the elves not just for readiness but for resolve. None flinched. The youngest of the group, a wiry scout named Arlen, met Kael's gaze, his watchful eye understanding the risk and already accepting it. Before they left, Maris stopped Kael in the doorway. "If you are seen, do not fight unless you have no choice. Everyone we lose now is one less for the real battle." Kael nodded curtly. "If we are seen, the battle has already gone wrong." They set off under a sky devoid of moonlight, the forest swallowing up their steps. The path was one that Kael knew well, half-hunting trail, half-forgotten game trail that skirted the ridges. It wound between quiet groves and shallow streams, each turn bringing them closer to the faint glow of the enemy camp. From a low hill they could see the tracks, their dark lines cutting through the forest floor. Kael crouched down, signaling the others to disperse. Torvin took from his pack heavy wedges, the kind used to split logs. Arlen carried a bag of powdered pitch that burned slowly but was hot when it ignited. The plan was simple: drive the wedges into the rail supports, loosen them, and light small fires to warp the wood beyond repair. Lyra led the way, sliding to the nearest support beam. Kael took the opposite side, working silently, his sword digging into the tree in controlled motions. The sound was drowned out by the forest, but he felt the urgency in every movement. The rails were strong, built to last, and each cut took precious minutes. They had completed the second lane when a faint metallic clank reached Kael's ears. He paused, signaling the others to hold on. A dim lantern swung between the trees from the camp's side. Two soldiers, speaking in low voices, moved slowly along the line. Kael waited until their light almost illuminated them, then gestured for the group to return to the thicket. They held their breath as the soldiers passed, the glow of the lantern touching Kael's sleeve before moving on. As the light faded, they worked faster, cutting off a third of the bush and scattering the thorns across the thicket. Torvin lit the pitch in 3 places, the faintest wisps of smoke rising. By the time they disappeared back into the forest, the first beams were already bending. Kael did not look back until the glow of the camp had faded. The rails were damaged, but he knew this was only the first step. The furnace would keep moving, and Avaric would not leave the job unfinished. They had slowed him down tonight. They would have to do more next time. By the following night, the enemy had repaired much of the damage to the tracks, though not without difficulty. Scouts reported that Avaric's soldiers were working by torchlight, twice as many brigades, the sound of hammer and saw carrying far into the forest. The attack had cost them a day, perhaps 2, but Kael knew that delay alone would not win the battle. The furnace continued to advance, and with each mile the valley's defenses became more vulnerable. It was Lyra who had insisted on the next strike. "If we wait, they will finish the repairs and guard the tracks so tightly that we will never get close again. The furnace moves slower than the soldiers, but it never stops. We hit it now, or we will never have the chance." Kael weighed the risk. The sentry furnaces would be ready after the last raid, and its location in the center of the camp made escape unlikely. But the more he thought about Avaric's strange machine, the more he became convinced that it was the centerpiece of the enemy's plan. Disabling it, even briefly, could change the course of the battle. The group was smaller this time. Kael had chosen just 4 fighters: Lyra, Torvin, Arlen, and Selan, a knife fighter who had been stalking enemy patrols for weeks. They carried no heavy weapons, only what they could draw and use silently. Their goal was not to destroy the furnace outright. It was too large and too strong for that, but to damage the mechanisms that powered its fire, forcing the enemy to halt it for repairs. They set out just before moonrise, using the deep darkness to camouflage their approach. The camp lay ahead in a shallow clearing, its perimeter marked by lines of sentry fires. From the edge of the forest, Kael had his first clear view of the furnace up close. It was wider than the siege tower and the outbuilding, its surface covered in shifting patterns of dim light. Pipes and channels ran from its base into the ground, and soldiers moved around it in even patrols. The humming was louder here, almost a vibration in the bones. Torvin pointed to the north side. "Less guarded. Probably where they feed the furnace from the supply wagons." Kael nodded, signaling Selana to widen the circle and create a brief distraction, noise to distract one patrol while the rest slipped in. They waited for her to take up position, and then from the far side of the camp came the faint clatter of metal on stone. The 2 guards backed away at the sound. Kael led the others through the gap, keeping low until they reached the shadow of the furnace. The heat was stifling up close, beads of sweat forming instantly on his neck. Arlen produced a pouch of groundstone powder, designed to clog gears when thrown into moving parts. Kael found a loading chute, a narrow slot where fuel crates were dropped into the machine, and poured the powder inside. They were halfway to the retreat when a voice called out from the darkness. "Stop!" A soldier stepped in their path, squinting as he studied their unfamiliar faces. Shouts rang out from the camp, torches blazing. "Run!" Kael ordered, and they ran. Behind them, the alarm bells rang out, their shrill sounds echoing far away. Arrows hissed in the darkness, one of them hitting a tree right in front of Kael's face. Torvin stayed behind long enough to knock over a stack of fuel crates, the crash scattering burning coals to the ground. They reached the edge of the forest, and behind them came the sound of pursuit. Celan turned to them from the shadows, her knife wet. The forest swallowed them again, but the enemy did not stop pursuing them. They ran for a long time without stopping, weaving through roots and undergrowth, until the signals finally faded into the distance. Only then did Kael allow himself to slow down, the others taking cover in a low ravine. Lyra was the first to catch her breath. The powder is buried. It won't stop the furnace forever, but they'll have to rip out half the feed system to clean it. Kael didn't respond immediately. The attack worked, but the enemy responded faster than he expected. Now they would know that the elves could strike at the heart of the camp. Which meant that the next move would come from Avaric, and it wouldn't be slow. By the next evening, scouts began to return with news from the enemy camp. The furnace had fallen silent at dawn. Workers swarmed along its flanks, removing panels and pulling out twisted pipes. The hum that had pulsed day and night since its arrival had faded, replaced by the clanking of tools and the shouts of overseers. For the first time since Avaric's troops had entered the valley's approaches, the tracks were empty. The mood in the council chamber had changed. The elders, silent for weeks, now spoke with an energy that Kael had not seen since the first days of the offensive. "They have stopped," Silver said, leaning over the table. "Every day that machine is still is a day we hold our ground." Maris even allowed herself a rare smile. "Perhaps they are not as invincible as they thought." Kael didn't let his optimism carry him too far, but he felt the weight on his shoulders ease a little. The attack had worked exactly as planned. For the first time, they had struck at the core of the enemy and escaped to tell the tale. And the knowledge that Avaric's people could be hurt, could be slowed, would spread through the valley like a spark in dry tinder. Outside the hall, he found Lyra talking quietly to Arlen and Celan, reviewing the trails they had used during the raid. They were already thinking about their next strike. "If we can hit the supply wagons while the furnace is burning, they'll be forced to ration what they have left," Lyra said. "And if we can keep them from moving until the rains come, they'll drown their own tracks in mud." Kael nodded. "One step at a time. We are using this pause to strengthen the valley's defenses. If they bring back the furnace, they will come harder than before." The next 2 days passed without a sound of rails. Patrols reported that the enemy foraging parties had grown larger, moving further into the forest to gather fuel and food. The elves took advantage of this opportunity to retake the small outposts along the southern edge, pushing their observation lines closer to the camp. Even the youngest among them began to carry bows, a grim readiness of a people who understood that survival depended on more than just the warriors themselves. On the third day, the captured scout was brought to Kael. The man was a man, thin and mud-spattered, with a cut above his eye. At first he refused to speak, but when Kael dismissed the guards and questioned him alone, the story became known. "They can't clean the feed to the furnace," the man admitted reluctantly. "Gunpowder, whatever you put in there will melt inside. They'll have to rebuild some of it. It'll take weeks." Kael studied him for a long time. "Why should I tell you this?" "Because I've seen what happens when people like you are cornered," the scout said quietly. "And I don't want to be there when it happens." Kael sent him under guard, but the words lingered. If even the enemy scouts feared what might happen next, the balance of power was shifting. That night there was a small feast, nothing grand, just bread, roots, and the last of the autumn fruits, but it carried the burden of a people who had found evidence that could harm the creature that hunted them. And yet, even in the warmth of the hearth, Kael's thoughts lingered on the image of the torn furnace, the glow of its patterns. It was a victory, but victories could breed overconfidence as easily as hope. Avaric had not achieved his position through hesitation. Somewhere in this camp, the man was already planning his response, and Kael suspected that it would not be deliberate or cautious. Before dawn, Kael walked alone to the ridge above the valley. The forest stretched before him, silent and dark, and behind it the faint flicker of enemy torches marked their halted line. For the first time, the line felt less like a wall than something that could be broken. But deep down, he knew that if it broke, it might not go in the direction he wanted. The fourth day after the furnace stopped began with a pale, cloudless dawn. Kael was on the training ground, sparring with Arlen, when a horn sounded from the northern guard post. 3 notes, short, sharp, insistent. The sound cut through the morning like a sword, and every warrior within earshot froze before moving as one toward the edge of the valley. Kael reached the ridge just as Lyra arrived from the southern patrol. Her breathing was heavy, her eyes already scanning the horizon. On the plain, the enemy camp was moving, not the slow, deliberate work of repair, but the swift, orderly chaos of an army shifting its lines. Hundreds of soldiers moved in columns toward the eastern flank, dragging siege towers on reinforced wheels. Behind them came something stranger, massive wagons, chained together, each covered with heavy tarpaulins that bulged as if something inside had shifted and pressed against the fabric. Torwin joined them, his face grim. They no longer move on rails. They bring the fight here. Kael watched as the lead wagon drew to a halt at the edge of the forest. Avaric himself rode ahead on a black horse, his armor reflecting the sun brightly. He raised his hand, and the tarpaulin swung back. What appeared made Kael gasp. Inside each wagon, in iron cages, were held creatures the elves had not seen in living memory, beasts taller than 2 men, their hides covered in bone plates, their eyes pale and murky but burning with a strange light. The chains bound their limbs, but even as they restrained their movements, they shook the frame of the cart. Lyra's voice was low but sharp. War dragons. I thought they had all been destroyed in the southern purge. That was so, Kael said evenly. Avaric must have found a way to breed them in captivity. Even as they spoke, the leaders began to urge the beasts forward, prodding them with long spears tipped with burning pitch. The creatures roared, a sound that was not entirely animal. Their chains clanged. Enemy soldiers lined up behind them, using the beasts as living battering rams to clear a path into the forest. Within minutes, the first trees were split under the weight of the dragons. The leaders guided them with brutal precision, forcing them into the thickest parts of the undergrowth. Smoke bombs followed them, choking the air and stripping the forest of its natural cover. The valley's protective shields, designed to slow intruders, reacted sluggishly to the beasts, as if unsure whether they were part of the living world they were designed to protect. Kael did not wait for the council's call. Take the archers to the front lines, he told Lyra. Torvin, take the hunters and flank them. We don't stop the soldiers, we stop the beasts. The first volley of arrows barely slowed the dragons. Their brass hides deflected most of the arrows, and the few that struck between the plates only made the beasts fight harder. One of them broke free of its chain and rushed through the undergrowth, scattering the defenders before being brought down by the coordinated blows of 3 hunters. Kael moved through the chaos, firing arrows at the handlers, trying to cut the control lines before the dragons could be driven deeper. He saw Lyra leap from a branch above to cut the chain, freeing the beast, which turned on its captors before being crushed. With each victory, 2 new breaches opened at the edge of the forest. The horn sounded again from the ridge, this time not a warning, but a call to retreat to the inner defenses. Kael felt the pull, the need to regroup, but he also knew that if they allowed the beasts to advance too far, the valley itself would become a battlefield before dark. By the time the fighting subsided, the ground near the tree line was riddled with deep potholes. The enemy had retreated, but the damage was obvious. The outer defenses had collapsed in 3 places, leaving gaps wide enough for the army to pass through unhindered. The furnace was still damaged, but that didn't matter now. Avaric had found another way to break into the valley. Kael stood among the rubble, acrid smoke clinging to his throat. The victory they had won a few days ago seemed distant, almost foolish. The rails and the furnace were only one path. There were many of them now, and each would be harder to block than the last. The night after the Dragon War assault was heavy with the smell of burning wood and wet earth. No one in the valley slept. Fires burned along the inner wall, casting shifting shadows on faces drawn with exhaustion. Kael stood before the council not to ask for their approval but to tell them what must be done. The gaps in the defenses could not be closed quickly, and if Avaric pressed again at dawn, the inner defenses would collapse in a matter of hours. There was only one way to end this, before the valley itself was taken. "We are fighting him," Kael said, his voice carrying through the hall. "Not a raid, not a blow at the railings, we are going at him directly. If Avaric falls, the army will lose its order. Without him, the siege will fail." Some of the elders objected, warning that the absence of one leader would not end the war. But Torwin backed him up. "Without Avaric's orders, these beasts will turn on themselves, and the soldiers will scatter. It's a risk, but it's the only chance we have left." A plan quickly formed. At dawn, a small force was to slip through the eastern gap, using the chaos of the reconstruction work to reach the heart of the enemy camp. Kael was to lead them. Lyra, Torwin, Selan, and Arlen were to go with him. Their goal was not to fight the army, but simply to reach the command pavilion, defeat Avaric, and escape before the soldiers could regroup. They set out in the early hours of dawn, shrouded in the lingering smoke from the previous day's fires. The eastern gap was poorly defended, the enemy focusing most of their forces on driving the dragons back into position. The group moved quickly through the churning mud, past the shattered remains of rails and the carcasses of beasts too wounded to move. The camp was waking as they reached its edge. Kael could hear the clatter of tools on the furnace, the shouts of orders from the leaders, the restless stomping of dragons in their cages. Ahead loomed the command pavilion, its lacquered panels gleaming with dew. 2 guards stood outside. Selan and Arlen silently took them in. Inside, the air was filled with the heat of the brazier. Avaric stood over the table, a fragment of Heartstone in his hand, its faint light reflecting in his eyes. He did not look surprised to see Kael. "So," he said in a calm voice, "the last of the champions of the forest comes to end the war with one blow." Kael drew his sword but did not rush forward. "You have driven beasts into our home, burned our trees, and broken our wards. Why continue the fight when you can leave with your life?" "Because my life is worthless without the seed," Avaric replied. "I will not see the kingdoms of men crumble while the power that saves them rots in your soil." "You intend to rule them," Kael said. "To save them," Avaric corrected, gripping the Heartstone more tightly. "You think this war is about conquest. It's about survival, mine, yours, everyone's. But you're too bound to your traditions to see that." There was nothing more to say. Kael moved. Steel met steel as Avaric's sword rose toward his, the clash echoing in the stifling air. Arlen snatched the Heartstone from the table. Avaric saw the theft and wrenched himself free from Kael, lunging for the boy. Kael caught him, their swords clashing, the tension in his hands matching the cold determination in Avaric's eyes. It was Torwin who ended it, the Lord staggering, dropping his weapon, his hand still reaching for the Heartstone as if by sheer will he could close the distance. There were shouts from outside, the camp knew. Kael seized the Heartstone and gave the signal to retreat. They made their way through the edge of the camp, dodging arrows. By the time they reached the forest, the enemy horns had already sounded, but there was no organized pursuit. Without Avaric's orders, the soldiers were scattered in confusion, their leaders struggling to hold back the dragons. When they returned to the valley, the defenders were already preparing for another assault. Kael held the Heartstone high for all to see. The reaction was instant, a roar of relief. But Kael knew that the war was not over. The armies could retreat and regroup. The power of the Heartstone could protect them, but only if they learned to wield it. In the weeks that followed the fall of Avaric, the valley was a place of both renewal and quiet grief. The enemy had retreated across the plains, leaving their tracks half buried in mud and their broken machines rusting in the winter rains. The surviving war dragons were left to live on the edge of the forest. Without their leader, the human soldiers had no desire to advance any further. But for the elves, victory came at a price. The outer defenses remained shattered. Even with the Heartstone in hand, the elders were uncertain how quickly they could be repaired. The damage to the forest could not be repaired in a single season. Scars of rotted soil and blackened stumps marked the places where the dragons had passed, and the soil itself seemed to bear the brunt of the war. In the clearings, small groups of survivors worked to replant what might grow before winter deepened. Kael avoided the council chambers when he could. The Heartstone was kept in a guarded hall, studied by elders and mages who believed they could unlock its secrets. He did not want to claim it, but its presence felt like a question that would not go away. Avaric's words still echoed in his mind, about survival, about the power to change the world. The man was ruthless, but Kael could not deny that in his mind he was fighting for something he believed was necessary. Lyra remained at the southern border, leading patrols to make sure that no enemy stragglers slipped back into the valley. Torwin returned to the western ridges, training young warriors who had survived the war but had not yet seen its worst. Arlen spent most of his days in the Root Hall, talking to the mages about the fragment taken from Avaric's tent. They all seemed to be trying to find their place in the world that had shifted beneath their feet. One evening, as the sun was setting over the edge of the forest, Kael climbed alone to a ridge above the valley. From there he could see the faint line of plains stretching to the horizon. Somewhere beyond those limits lay the human kingdoms, and with them others who might one day decide the valley was worth taking. The Heartstone could heal their home, perhaps even strengthen it beyond what it had been before, but the power always called to those who sought it. The wind carried the faint sound of an owl's hoot, distant and lonely. Kael stood there until the light faded completely, knowing that this was not the end, as the stories told. Wars did not end with the fall of one man. They ended when those who remained chose what to build in the space that was left. When he returned to the village, fires were lit and children ran between the houses, unafraid of the horns in the night. It was a fragile peace, but it was theirs. Kael allowed himself to breathe it in, remembering the moment. Tomorrow the work of rebuilding would begin again, and with it a quiet vigilance that would keep them ready for whatever came next. For now, the valley held. And that was enough.